Ever get that feeling, that you're just swimming in news, headlines flashing past, but you're struggling to really grasp what it all means?
Yeah, like you see the pieces, but the bigger picture is fuzzy.
Exactly. That's what we try to cut through here on the deep dive.
We take a whole bunch of sources, pull out the really important bits, the interesting stuff, and try to connect those dots for you.
Make sense of the noise, basically. And today, wow, we've got quite the mix.
We really do.
We're digging into articles on academic research standards, some worrying trends there. Then there are new regulations for pharmacies.
And tax policy changes affecting landlords this time.
Plus the dairy industry, why milk prices are soaring. And what the Sovereign Wealth Fund is doing with its money.
Don't forget tourism challenges and even how the tax appeal system is changing.
Right. It seems like a random collection, doesn't it? But that's the mission today.
Exactly. We're looking for the connections, the underlying currents. What are the big trends and challenges shaping Ethiopia's economy, its society, when you look at all these things together?
We're hunting for the so what behind the headlines.
Precisely. Let's find those surprising links.
Okay, let's jump in. First up, academic research quality. Now, Ethiopia's research output has, it's exploded since 2001.
It really has. We're talking going from maybe 260-something papers in Scopus, that's a big international database, kind of a benchmark,
right,
to over 6,000 by 2020. That's a massive increase in quantity.
Huge numbers. But here's the catch, right? The quality aspect.
Well, yes. That's where it gets concerning. One measure, a pretty stark one, is the rate of retractions, papers being pulled after publication.
And Ethiopia's rate is?
It's ranked the worst globally, highest retraction rate in the world.
Wow. Worst in the world. What are the numbers?
It's about 0.35% of all papers, which might sound small, but it actually represents over 12% of the research published just since 2022.
Okay, that's significant. So what's going on? Why are so many papers being retracted, and what does this do to trust, public trust, donor trust?
The sources suggest it's largely driven by this intense publisher pressure in academia.
Ah, that old chestnut.
Yeah. And unfortunately, it seems to be pushing some towards, misconduct. One study found over 37.7% of academics admitted to things like plagiarism, making up data, issues with authors.
A third. That's alarming. And it's not just hypothetical, is it? There was that case at Bahir Dar University.
Exactly. They had to annul, over 25 promotions because they were based on fraudulent articles. That points to something more systemic, not just a few isolated cases.
So the system itself, the promotion policies, might be part of the problem.
It seems so. The harmonized policy from 2013 tends to reward just the number of publications, the sheer volume, more than the actual impact or the integrity of the research.
Quantity over quality, basically.
Pretty much. And think about the smaller universities. They face the same pressure, but often without the resources.
Yeah.
Labs, decent internet, journal subscriptions.
Right, so it's an uneven playing field, but the pressure's the same. That can't be good for overall quality.
It's a major challenge. Plus, the overall investment in research is low. We're talking 0.27% of GDP.
GDP, gross domestic product, the total value of everything produced.
Right, and that 0.27% is way below the African Union target. Universities only spend about 4% of their budgets on research.
So researchers have to rely on
foreign grants, mostly, especially in health, which is why you see a lot of biomedical and life sciences research dominating the landscape.
Ah, okay. So that focus isn't necessarily driven by local priorities alone, but by where the funding is coming from.
That's a big part of it. And this lack of robust, homegrown research in some areas has real consequences. The sources mention examples where policies were imported like a Scandinavian education assessment system or primary healthcare blueprints without enough local adaptation.
And they didn't work as well as hoped.
Apparently not. It really shows why you need strong local research to make sure policies actually fit the context.
Makes sense. It's not all bad news, though, is it? Agriculture seems to be a bright spot, that Quancho Tef variety.
Yes, that's a great success story. Shows what happens when research is well supported and meets a real need. But outside agriculture,
the links between universities and industry are weak.
Very weak, according to the sources. There's often this preference for just buying foreign plans or expertise instead of tapping into local academic knowledge.
So how do you fix this? What are the suggestions?
Well, changing promotion criteria to reward impact, not just numbers. That's a big one.
Focus on what the research actually achieves. Makes sense.
And establishing a National Research Integrity Council. So that hasn't quite happened yet.
A sort of ethics watchdog for research.
Exactly. Plus, basic stuff. Better infrastructure, more resources for those smaller campuses, maybe lighter teaching loads so academics actually have time for research.
And more funding, domestic funding.
Definitely. Aiming for that 1% of GDP target the AU set. That could really help diversify research beyond just health.
Any smaller steps mentioned?
Yeah, things like piloting imported policies first, testing them out small scale, and maybe mentorship programs linking universities with industry.
So there are ideas on the table, but actually making them happen, that's the challenge.
Absolutely. Implementation is key.
Okay, let's shift gears completely. New pharmacy regulations. This sounds like it could really shake things up for local businesses and maybe even patients.
It's definitely a significant change. These new national standards come from the Institute of Ethiopian Standards, and the EFDA, the Food and Drug Authority, is going to enforce them.
And the reason behind it, why now?
Well, the EFDA says it's partly due to concerns raised by the World Health Organization, the WHO. And generally, there's a push to harmonize standards across the country, protect patients better.
Okay, so what are the big changes? I heard something about minimum space.
Yes, quite specific requirements. A minimum total floor space of 50 square meters.
50, okay.
And within that, you need a dedicated 12 square meter area just for drug information. Plus designated spots for dispensing, counseling, storage, compounding.
Wow, pretty detailed. And staff qualifications, too.
Mm-hmm. And the one that's really causing a stir is the distance rule.
Yes, the 100-meter rule. Explain that.
Pharmacies now need to be at least 100 meters away from other health facilities like clinics or hospitals, and also 100 meters from things considered potential contamination sources like public toilets or certain industries.
100 meters? In a busy city like Addis, that sounds tricky, especially for small pharmacies.
Exactly. That's the main worry. Finding a spot that meets those criteria and is affordable. We saw that example, rent of 60,000 birr a month in central areas.
Ouch. So the fear is that small players get pushed out. And what about patient access? Isn't it usually good to have a pharmacy near a clinic?
That's the other big concern. It seems impractical for patient convenience. Many small operators are genuinely worried about going out of business. It's a huge financial burden.
I imagine. But they have some time to adjust, right?
Yes, there's a 2-year grace period for existing pharmacies, but whether that's enough to overcome the hurdles of finding and affording a new compliant location, that's the question.
Is there any defense for these standards? What does the EFDA say?
Winu Katelli from the EFDA argues the standards are based on studies looking at average pharmacy sizes. And one pharmacy owner, Mo Weish Tefera, actually saw a potential upside preventing too many pharmacies clustering together, market saturation.
A silver lining, maybe.
Yeah.
But still, the cost. Changing rooms, offices, toilets, waiting areas, that all adds up.
Definitely adds to the operational costs. Yeah. It's a real balancing act. You want higher standards, patient safety.
Of course.
But you also need to consider business viability and making sure people can actually get to a pharmacy easily.
How many pharmacies are we talking about?
Over 600 nationwide, apparently, with more than half in Addis. And it's a market expected to bring in significant revenue.
So what do the experts think? Is this a good move overall despite the pain points?
Mixed views. Sissy Endale sees it as a necessary starting point to raise standards long term. But Dula Desalegn urges caution, wants a more gradual rollout so access isn't badly hit, especially outside the capital.
And the EFDA, are they likely to budge?
They seem pretty firm on preventing clustering and ensuring services are spread out more fairly. It'll be really interesting to see how this plays out over the next 2 years.
Okay, let's turn to taxes. This one's a bit unusual. Landlords in Addis Abeba being held responsible partly for their tenants' unpaid taxes.
Yeah, it's a novel approach. The Addis Abeba Revenue Bureau is trying to claw back over 10 billion birr in outstanding taxes.
10 billion, that's a lot, and their thinking is.
According to Sonet Ayo at the Bureau, some businesses deliberately evade taxes by just moving premises frequently and re-registering under a different name.
Ah, the shell game.
Sort of.
Yeah.
So the Bureau sees this as getting the public, specifically landlords, involved in compliance.
So landlords become tax watchdogs. What happens if they don't report a dodgy tenant?
Well, the language used is pretty strong. Failing to report tax evasion is being likened to cooperating with a criminal. That puts landlords in a difficult position.
I'll say.
Yeah.
You can imagine the awkward conversations. Hi, just checking. Are you up to date on your taxes? What are property owners saying?
Understandably, they're worried. Concerns about unclear legal duties, straining relationships with tenants. One owner, Belena Desta, was initially okay with it, but then got worried about tenants just disappearing, leaving unpaid tax bills behind.
And others think it's just unfair.
Yes, Tedla Asmamar argued it's basically transferring the government's job of tax enforcement onto private citizens.
Does this relate at all to past problems with tax clearance? I heard the old system caused headaches.
It did, apparently causing big delays in property deals. The Bureau has tried to refine this new policy, though. With a circular clarifying, it applies mainly when tenants are over a month behind on taxes.
So not just any small delay. Is there a better way?
One tax advisor, DeWitt Kajela, suggested maybe linking the responsibility to the income generated from the property, rather than just the fact of tenancy.
Interesting idea. And technology's involved here too, right? A digital platform.
Yes. Sonnet called it a digital monitoring platform. The idea is to link tax records with property ownership and tenancy databases.
So they can see in real time who owns what, who rents what, and if taxes are paid.
That seems to be the goal. It could trigger automatic flags, maybe even block services like transferring title deeds if taxes are overdue.
Sounds efficient in theory, but will it work smoothly in practice? Any skepticism?
Oh, yes. Small business owners are wary. We heard from one cafe owner, Bizret Temizgen, who waited 6 months for tax clearance, even after paying up.
6 months? That doesn't inspire confidence.
Baruch Negussi, another tax expert, pointed out that delays often happen because of audits or complex transactions. He stressed that for this new landlord policy to work, enforcement needs to be really clear and consistent.
Right. Good intentions, but execution is everything. Avoid penalizing compliant landlords and businesses.
Exactly. Clear rules, fair application. That's crucial.
Let's move to something hitting home for many. Milk prices. A big jump, right?
That's
around 20%.
Yes, a really significant increase. And it's making milk, a basic staple, unaffordable for families like Azamins, who was mentioned in one source.
Just adding to the pressure on household budgets already stretched thin.
Absolutely. And the root cause. It seems to be a perfect storm. Supply is shrinking, and costs for farmers are shooting up.
We heard from Gebru Temizda, a dairy farmer. What's hitting him?
Feed costs, mainly. Wheat straw prices have soared, and his own milk production is down. Plus, the market price he gets for his milk is really volatile, especially around fasting seasons.
Unpredictable income, rising costs. Tough business. And official figures show a production shortfall.
A big one. About 2.9 billion liters short of the annual target. And another complicating factor is a new land use directive.
What's that about?
The Ministry of Water and Energy is banning urban dairy farms near waterways. For environmental reasons, which makes sense. But
it forces farmers to move or shut down, adding to the supply problem.
Exactly. Relocating a dairy operation is a massive challenge. Plus, potential fines if they don't manage waste properly in the new location.
So supply is squeezed. What about other costs?
We heard reports of milk suppliers just disappearing. Raw milk prices are up 85. Burr going up to over 95 burr. Concentrated feed prices also jumped sharply.
And wasn't there a tax change affecting feed too?
Yes. VAT exemptions on animal feed were removed, value-added tax. That just piled on more costs for farmers.
So everyone's feeling the pinch. Processors too.
Definitely. Big players like Shola Milk have apparently cut production, having to source milk from further away. And that inevitably means higher prices for pasteurized milk and yogurt on the shelves.
And whenever prices shoot up for basics like this, you worry about quality, right? Adulteration.
Sadly, yes. There are concerns and warnings about milk being diluted or adulterated. As Stefanos Katashiou from the Addis Food and Drug Authority mentioned, confiscating adulterated butter. Plus worries about unsafe transport, lack of proper refrigeration.
Food safety risks on top of high prices. Not good. Is anything being done?
The Ministry of Agriculture is drafting a new bill for stricter regulation, which is needed. But one economist, Amiro Tazeze, noted that even where production has improved, the link between farmers and the market is still poor.
So it's complex. Environmental rules, tax changes, soaring input costs, weak market links, all feeding into that 20% price hike hitting families.
It really illustrates how interconnected everything is. Solving this needs a multi-pronged approach supporting farmers, fixing market chains, ensuring safety, maybe revisiting those tax changes on feed.
Okay, let's shift to finance. Ethiopian Investment Holdings, the sovereign fund, EIH, they've put nearly 7 billion birr into Treasury bills. That sounds new.
It is new for them, yes, and it's seen as a significant move. The interpretation is that it's partly designed to boost private sector confidence in buying government securities, these T-bills.
Why is that needed? Don't people usually buy government bills?
Well, historically in Ethiopia, the main buyers have been banks and pension funds, often because they had to, through regulations. Private sector interest has been pretty low.
So EIH is trying to signal that these are actually a good investment now.
That seems to be part of the message. Central Bank Governor Memo Moretu pointed to attractive interest rates on Burr assets, average around 16.5%.
16.5%, okay. And the National Bank, the NBE, they've launched a new platform?
Yes, a digital system, the Single Entity Multi-Asset Central Securities Depository, or CSD. The aim is to make it easier for more players, including individuals and maybe insurance companies, to buy T-bills.
Make it more accessible. And EIH's own view, their CFO.
Rita Gashu called it ice-breaking, a way to lead by example, and also just good portfolio diversification for EIH itself. The money came from dividends from the state-owned companies they manage.
Interesting. So past attempts to get private investors interested didn't really work?
Not very well, no. An auction back in 2021, for instance, didn't attract much private money. The insurance industry apparently often finds they can get better returns just putting money in bank deposits, maybe up to 23%.
So T-bills haven't been competitive enough?
That's been the challenge. But Governor Mimo hopes wider participation now could help control inflation, which he says is currently low, though the IMF predicts higher, and maybe allow the central bank to lower policy interest rates eventually.
And this ties into other shifts, like the central bank not directly funding the government deficit anymore.
Exactly. Moving away from that practice is important for controlling inflation. Plus, there are other reforms coming, lifting bank credit caps, potentially allowing foreign banks in. It's all part of trying to modernize the financial sector.
What do investment experts think of EIH's move?
Merit B. Fikiri-Yohannes, an advisor, supported it. He suggested further steps like using brokers for auctions and issuing longer-term government bonds to develop the market.
Makes sense. Any criticism?
He did question the mandatory T-bill investments for pension funds, arguing it might be limiting the returns for pensioners' savings.
Right, forcing them to buy might not get them the best deal. So EIH's investment is a potentially positive first step, but more needs to happen to build a really active government securities market.
Precisely. It could be a catalyst, but needs follow through with market reforms to make T-bills truly attractive and integrate them better into the wider economy.
Okay, final topic area, tourism. Sounds like it's facing some pretty significant headwinds, despite some signs of recovery post-pandemic.
That's definitely the message coming from Minister Salamo Eskasa. Security risks, bureaucracy, infrastructure gaps, these are the main culprits holding the sector back.
So performance is lagging, targets being missed.
Yes. New investments are below target, tourist arrival numbers are below target, revenue generated also below target. Even visits to national museums haven't hit the goal.
And what about looking after the attractions themselves, heritage sites?
Progress there is slow, too. Restoration efforts are only about 58% complete. Repatriating artifacts stolen or taken abroad is also proving difficult. Only 7 out of 24 targeted items returned recently.
Why is it so slow? What are the challenges?
Aigaba Ailu, from the Heritage Authority, mentioned really serious issues, like experts being kidnapped in conflict zones, and just the sheer complexity of negotiating repatriation. Plus, staffing shortages in the ministry itself.
That's tough. And it's not just cultural sites, is it? Conservation efforts, too.
Right. Problems with human-wildlife conflict, elephants, for instance. Not enough compensation for communities affected. Shortfalls in things like livestock vaccinations near parks, environmental restoration work lagging, and land disputes are apparently hindering tourism investment in several key areas.
So, a lot of obstacles. But the minister sounded optimistic about arrival numbers compared to pre-pandemic.
She did point to that increase in positive global travel trends. But the reality is, those negative travel advisories from other countries are still a major deterrent for international tourists.
Are they trying to counter those?
Yes, doing things like organizing guided tours for diplomats to showcase safety and attractions. But then you have domestic issues piling on, too.
But look,
new fire safety rules for hotels in Addis are causing backlash from owners because they're expensive to implement. Fitty Wolzenbet raised those concerns. Plus, ongoing problems with fuel costs and power cuts don't help the visitor experience.
And lawmakers are critical, too.
Yes, questioning the slow pace of infrastructure development needed for tourism, the lack of foreign investment, illegal hunting, staff shortages. Asha Yahya was asking tough questions.
What's the ministry's response to the infrastructure issue?
They say they're collaborating with the Roads Authority and Ethio Telecom. But similar complaints about regulations and infrastructure are coming from hotel operators in the regions, too.
It sounds like there's potential, especially maybe domestic tourism in places like Sidama, but unlocking the big international market is proving really hard.
Shifaram Muleta, a tourism expert, put his finger on it. Security is probably the number one deterrent for foreign investors right now. Until that's convincingly addressed, along with the infrastructure and bureaucracy, growth will likely remain constrained.
Okay, one last quick one. The Federal Tax Appeals Commission is expanding, setting up regional offices.
Yes, in Amhara, Oromia, and Sidama regions initially. The goal announced by Mulugeta Ayulu is to make it easier logistically and financially for taxpayers outside Addis to challenge tax assessments they disagree with.
That sounds like a good move. People have been complaining about having to travel to Addis.
For a long time, yes. Complaints about travel costs, confusing procedures, long delays. We heard anecdotes about a farmer from Bahir Dar, Himanat Tafer from Hawassa. The burden was significant.
Do we know how many cases they handle? Is the system overloaded?
In the third quarter, they had over 800 new appeals, over 1,100 total cases pending. They decided nearly 700 cases involving about 3.6 billion birr in disputed taxes. The official processing time is meant to be 120, 180 days, but delays are common.
And you still have to pay a portion up front, right?
Yes, the deposit requirement is still there.
Yeah.
And one expert, Katima Adayan, cautioned that just opening physical branches isn't enough.
What else is needed?
He mentioned taxpayer support services, simpler procedures, maybe using technology like virtual hearings to really improve access and efficiency. Decentralization needs to be more than just bricks and mortar.
Makes sense. Okay, so pulling all these threads together, quite a tapestry.
It really is. And as we've gone through these different reports, research, pharmacies, tax, milk, finance, tourism, tax appeals, some clear themes keep popping up, don't they?
Definitely. This tension between growth and quality seems central. Pushing for more research output, but struggling with integrity. Wanting more tourism, but hitting infrastructure and safety walls.
Exactly. And then there's the challenge of rolling out national rules locally. We saw that clearly with the pharmacy regulations and the hotel fire safety standards. What works on paper in Addis faces real hurdles on the ground.
Plus, the impact of wider economic forces is unavoidable. Global trends, domestic inflation, tax policies, all feeding into things like milk prices or the push for T-bill investment.
And across the board, there are these efforts to improve efficiency and access the digital tax platform, expanding the tax tribunal. But always this gap between the ambition and the current reality.
And these aren't abstract issues. They directly affect people's lives, their businesses, their access to services.
Absolutely. From the academic facing pressure to publish, to the family struggling with milk costs, to the small pharmacy owner worried about new rules.
Thanks for listening.
See you next time.